Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of Staffing Industry M&A Insiders, produced by Becker. I am the host of the program, Marty Borosko. For those of you who don't know me, I am the practice group leader at Becker. Becker has one of the largest industry-focused practices in the country. We have offices on the East and the West Coast. And we've had the pleasure of representing over 150 staffing industry brands over the past decade. I personally focus my practice on strategic issues that impact the staffing industry, including such topics as mergers and acquisitions. And this program, Staffing Industry M&A Market Insiders, is a program where I speak to other staffing industry M&A market insiders about issues impacting the marketplace today and what we think it will be in the future as well. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with John Larson. John Larson is the principal consultant in TechServe Alliance's fairly new M&A marketplace. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Marty. Glad to be here.
I appreciate you carving out a little time from your busy schedule to talk shop with me.
Well, I look forward to it. Very enjoyable and exciting topic.
Yes, something that we spend most of our minutes each day on. So I know it's going to be a little bit of a challenge today because you and I could probably chat about the industry for much longer than anybody would want to listen. And we have a little bit of a time limitation. So I'd like to maybe focus in on two areas, John, that I know you have such particular expertise in, and maybe we can get into those two areas and drill down a little bit. Before we jump into the first topic, maybe we can lay the groundwork a little bit about your experience and your expertise in these areas by talking about your background and talking a little bit about TechServe Alliance's M&A Marketplace. I know what a success it's been, at least in the short time it's been open. Maybe you could take a second and describe the marketplace, how it works, and what people should know about it who aren't familiar with it.
Sure, glad to. I appreciate the opportunity, Marty. Actually, my background, I'm a business owner and operator and have been in the staffing industry since '97. And in that, over those ensuing years, I was president of 3 different staffing companies. I owned my own staffing company, which I had acquired. And in that process, I also merged with another company. Then we acquired 4 additional companies after that. And then in August of 19, we had an exit. So we sold the company. And so I've been through the full life cycle of buying, operating, owning, and then being able to acquire some others and then sell that combined entity. So that's really the credentials that I bring to the marketplace. I'm not an investment banker. I'm really much more of an operations person and look at it from an owner's perspective as they come to market. TechServe Alliance is about, the marketplace is about 1 year old. Mark Roberts, the CEO of TechServe, and I came together. I do serve on the board of directors of TechServe. And in that process, we took about 6 months. And the idea was to provide an offering, a service offering for our membership that really we thought was an underserved market in the M&A marketplace area. And that was those companies that they weren't quite sure that they wanted to sell, or they didn't know the process, or they were involved with, a friend of a friend, or just their local network as they went to market. So it was not very efficient. And they did not want to go to market in the traditional sense. So we thought that we had an opportunity to provide a service there. We developed the service. It's a multi-step process. And in doing so, just very simply, we work with an owner. We help them determine a value for their organization, for their company. And then they can make a decision, maybe I should not go to market yet. There's some things I need to do internally to enhance my marketability and the value of my company. And so as a result, maybe I should work on those first. So that's one option that some people take. Other times they may say, I'm ready to sell, let's go to market. And thus we go through the continuing steps of taking a look at it and preparing them for the marketplace, and then eventually taking them to the market for sale. We announced this January of last year, so it's a little over 12 months old. And in that time period, we've had 23 companies. These are all TechServe members that have gone through the program, and for various reasons. Some of them just to determine the valuation. Some of them may have needed it for a partnership agreement of some sort. Others, taking it to market. And we've had 6 companies that are either in the market or that have sold. We've actually closed on 2 of them the end of last year. And we've still got a couple more that are in the market that are active right now, talking to potential buyers. We've had over 50, actually, probably nearly 60 buyers that have signed up in the program, Marty, that are very actively engaged in looking at various companies of all different flavors. I oftentimes get the question, what size companies are you dealing with? And initially, we thought that, okay, this is for the smaller company, let's say under 15 million, which is a large part of the constituency of the TechServe Alliance membership. And that's where it started. And for the most part, it's stayed. I'd say that 15 million is the sweet spot. So there's some that are, in the 3 million, 5 million range, 6 million. So there's some in that range. And then that, I'll say 15 to 20 million seems to be the majority. And then there have been a few companies that are over that, all the way up into the 50 million range. So that's the size. The ones that have sold, they're in the low, they're in the single digit, in that 5 million range. And then the other one that sold, that's actually closed, was in the $15 million range. So that kind of gives a perspective on the size organizations that are coming to market.
Oh, that's very helpful, John. I mean, I have firsthand experience with the marketplace. I had the pleasure of representing one of the buyers of one of those deals you were talking about, and I was very impressed with the efficiency of how it worked. So I think that's great background. Maybe I know you take a very instrumental and hands-on role with the sellers in the marketplace. Maybe you could take a few minutes to talk about, the role that you yourself play with the sellers in the marketplace.
It's multifunction. In some ways, I'm acting as a consultant. Sometimes I'm a psychologist, or psychiatrist, as the case may be. And I really work with both the seller and also with the buyers to a little different extent. But in working with the sellers, I'm there to help them understand their business from a financial perspective, oftentimes that, the valuation perspective, but there absolutely are operational considerations in that as we take a look at that. As you know, Marty, when somebody wants to know the value of their company, the first question I get is, okay, what's the multiple today? And naturally the answer is, well, it all depends, and it really does. And as I've found out this past year, that there are so many different blends and approaches to the marketplace and the way people run their business and the way they keep records, quite frankly, that, it makes it kind of interesting. So I have to provide some counsel on that. But I help them through the stages. And really the first stage is understanding their own business. I mean, that's the most important part of it. And looking at it from not only from their perspective, from also what the market will take a look at. Okay, what are buyers looking for? And so I'm working with that seller to say, okay, you might want to consider this. An easy one is client concentration. That's one of the big items we take a look at. Naturally, in the small businesses, oftentimes there's client concentration. Okay, what impact does that have? What impact does it have on valuation? What can you do about it? how do you address that? If you don't go to market, what should you be doing in order to alleviate or address that particular concern? Because it does affect value. And so I work with them through those steps. So we get evaluation. And the other thing that I'm doing, Marty, in working with the business owner is, as they progress through the process, is helping them understand what it means. As we all know, their whole life is embodied in this company. Not only financially, their total net worth, the majority of their net worth is probably still within the company, and that's what they're trying to break loose or adjust. But there's also this emotional component. I mean, these owners, they started this from scratch, and oftentimes they started in their home or spare bedroom or their basement or whatever it was, and grew it from there. They've hired everybody, and oftentimes they're primary salespeople or recruiter, and so they're 100%, maybe 120% emotionally engaged in this business. So I'm helping them through that process, and the thought that takes place as they start to make that decision of, okay, should I sell my business, or I would like to sell my business? What does that mean? So part of what I do is not only the financial components and operational components, but what does life look like afterwards? Do you have a plan as an owner? Do you have a plan for post transaction life? What does that mean? And sometimes people are prepared for that and they have an idea, and sometimes they're not. So we kind of work through that process.
Right. Right. That's really helpful. I think that leads really nicely into our first kind of topic that I want to talk to you about, and that's management meetings. And I know that you are very involved with the sellers in TechServe Alliance's marketplace, in preparing them, participating, post management meetings. So I want to really try and leverage that expertise. To me, I think it's an expression we've all heard since we were kids. And then actually, I think very apropos here is, you never get a second chance to make a first impression, right? Right. I mean, we've all heard it. It's overused, but it actually works here, right? Because this is
Absolutely.
this is the first impression that the sellers get of the buyer gets of the sellers. So it's a critical stage of the process. Maybe you could talk to me a little bit about, how you work with sellers to get them prepared for management meetings, and in particular, also focus on, to me, you have a meeting, and I know everybody says this, but I don't believe a lot of people follow through. You have a meeting, you have a goal of a meeting, right? Right. So how do you prepare them, and what is the goal, critical goal or two that sellers should try and accomplish during these management meetings?
Right. It's really fairly straightforward, but having the design of that meeting and the execution of it are two different matters. So I find there to be a disparity between those two.
Yes,
but you're absolutely correct, Marty, in that there should be very specific objectives at the stage of a meeting or before the meeting. Each party knows a little bit about the other, but it's usually from a website, maybe from a teaser memo, or from a confidential information memorandum that's gone out. So that's kind of the extent of the information at that point. And the seller needs to realize that as they talk to a buyer, what the buyer is looking for. So we're assisting them in saying, okay, make sure you understand your financials, be very clear in what your objectives are as a business and your business operation. Be prepared to talk about your team, not by name, but okay, I have these recruiters and here's how we're set up, how we're established from an organizational and a go-to-market point. And if there's some differentiators, within your business, be able to clarify or clearly present those differentiators. And you want to make sure you do that. Most of all, and the number one item that I tell my sellers, please listen. All too often, what I find is that the seller they're doing that. They're selling too hard, and they need to be listening to the buyer and the questions that are being asked. So usually what I do is I say, okay, here's what we're going to do. You're going to have about a 5-minute intro, very similar to what you and I just did. Okay, you're going to have a 5-minute intro. The sellers or the buyer's going to have a 5-minute intro. There are going to be questions that are going to go back and forth. And then I moderate that. But in that preparation phase, one thing that people don't think about today, or oftentimes they don't, is that these meetings used to take place face to face. When I sold my business, I had meetings, in various parts of the country with various buyers, and usually it was a lunch, sometimes it was a dinner, but that's a very different atmosphere than what we're in right now. Most of the meetings today, nearly all the meetings are, they're, Zoom or team meetings or a video conference. And so you need to be prepared for that and understand what takes place in a video conference, down as simple as, okay, how you're dressed, how you present yourself, the view that the buyer has of you. So there's a physical component of it that's taking place in that. And like it or not, there's some, I won't necessarily say judgment, but there's impact on that. So that's very important. The other part of it is being succinct. Most business owners tend to talk too long. So I encourage them to be crisper in their communication. Send out, present the idea, encapsulate that, and boom, stop, go on to the next item. So
you need to speak to some of my partners. Lawyers have the same problem, John. So I might have you come in to talk to some of us. Go
ahead. I understand the issue well. So so it's really that, and the other part that I caution them on, or help them with, is the fact that there's this emotional. I keep going back to this, Marty. There are the facts, and then there's the emotional component of it, and often there's some importance to that, and they're enthusiastic. I mean, I want the seller to be enthusiastic about their business, in the way that it's presented. But at the same time, they need to understand that as a buyer they're looking at their business, and there's some facts that they want to understand in order to make a determination, do we go forward or not? So they need to be very crisp in the way they answer those questions, hopefully to put their best foot forward, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think I haven't participated in as many management meetings as you, because it's not always that the lawyers are involved that early, but certainly have been in a number of them. And what strikes me in the meetings I've been in is kind of this tug of war, and I think you've talked about a little bit, between the facts and the story, right? Everybody wants to tell a story,
right? But
how much is story, how much is facts, right? And so, I've been in a couple where the story and the facts just don't really match up when you look at it, right? And I'm usually in the buy side when I'm in the management meetings, and the client I'm representing, loses interest because of that. So, I found it interesting that you focused mostly on the facts of the story, and I think that's important, because it has to be a fact-based story, or the buyer's going to catch on at some point, right? Whether you fooled them at the management meeting, maybe, but they're going to catch on at some point.
And I tell my sellers, I said, there is no fooling. If there's an issue, let's get it out on the table early. If there's whatever it happens to be, present that, here's what we did, here's the response to it. We're trying to correct this, et cetera, whatever it happens to be. And because at some point in time, if you get to the point where you're in due diligence, the buyer's going to discover that. They're going to find it out. And that's not when you want the discovery to take place, if there's a challenge. Back to the story from it, I do encourage my sellers to have the story, but the story is as much about, to me, encompasses the culture of the organization. What cultural do we like? Because the other part of this management meeting is, okay, are these people that we feel comfortable that we could work with in the future? Whether we're going to be there as an owner or not, our organization is going to be there. And is there a good match? And sometimes the story is part of that on both sides. And, they come in from different perspectives. But I do encourage that, okay, that story is supported by factual information. And you can't just be, okay, oh, sorry, I just thought of another thought here, Marty, and that is, do not wing it. Oftentimes, or sometimes I'll have a person coming into a meeting and they're, like this is an ad hoc, situation, an ad hoc meeting, and I can just, present as I go along or make up answers, even though they may be correct. That's no, that's not an appropriate way to approach one of these meetings.
Yeah, for sure. Let's flip the lens a little bit and look at a buyer's perspective on these meetings. And, in particular, let's focus on the communication by buyers leading up to the meetings, right? Do's and don'ts there. How much information do you try and get before the meeting? How do you approach that time? Maybe you can share, what you think is an effective practice for buyers in terms of communicating with you and the sellers leading into that meeting.
That's a great question and comment, Marty. Naturally, the buyer wants as much information as they possibly can to reduce the risk of making a decision and providing, what they feel is an appropriate valuation and potential offer through a letter of intent. So the more information they can gather, the better. What I find occasionally is that there's a reach, and I'll say the reach, and it doesn't bother me at all, but the reach is really into what I would consider to be more due diligence items. Mm-hmm. And so I would encourage them not to go that deep, but I would encourage the buyer, as most of them do, ask whatever question you need in order to feel comfortable that you can make an offer for the company, or you may decide that I'm not going to make an offer for the company, so you can make an informed decision that'll take you to the next stage. So that's what I would encourage the buyer to do. And most of that is financial, number one. The second part of that is the buyer understanding the seller and understanding what the seller's motivation is. And we tend to think it's all about money, and the financial component is extremely important. Don't get me wrong there. It always is. But at the same time, that buyer is trying to get a feel for, and I say the culture, I use that term in quotes, Marty, it's somewhat hard to define, but depending upon how the seller has run and operated their business and the staff, employees that they have, is there a potential match on the buy side from the buyer standpoint? So there's a financial piece and there's a cultural piece, and I'd be asking questions that take me to that potentially the next step in the process from the buyer side. I would, as a buyer, I think it's very appropriate that they understand the motivation and I'll say forward view of the seller. And I think those are very appropriate questions to ask. And because on the sell side, I'm trying to help them through that process. What does it look like? Do you want to stay with the business? Do you want to exit the business? Do you want to be there for some extended time period in a transition? Are you willing to become an employee? I mean, as you know, there are many, many different scenarios that can take place. And so I think that's a good question to get on the table pretty early on from the buyer's perspective.
Give me a, you can pick the sell side, the buy side, whatever side you want. Give me a shining example of something a seller or a buyer did in one of these management meetings that you were, strikes you and is something that you've taken and, tried to employ in giving advice to sellers in preparation for these meetings.
The best meetings that I see is where both sides are prepared, number one. And as I find it, usually the buyer is better prepared. They've been at this more often than the seller is. So part of my job is to bring a little more parity to the situation. So if both sides are prepared, then it goes very smoothly. That's number one. Secondly, the best meetings take place when both parties are listening. And sometimes it's hard to listen because, okay, I want to get this information out. I want to present this information. I want to sell my company or whatever the case might be. Or sometimes it's the buyer. The buyer's pressing hard on why we're the best choice. And so as a result, neither party is listening to the other. And oftentimes it's a nuanced, component of that conversation that's taking place. The other meeting, I'd say the best meetings are where we have smaller groups of individuals. Maybe it's a couple from each side. I have been in situations where the video on the buyer side, there were 6 people in the room, and a single seller or maybe two partners. That makes for a very difficult situation, especially in an initial meeting, way before before a letter of intent, way before due diligence, because everybody has the agenda. So if principals can be the primary players in the initial meetings, that makes for a much more successful meeting. I would say the other the really good example is where there's direct statements by both buyer and seller that are nuanced isn't the right term, but where people are straightforward. Okay, this my early indication, if I'm the seller, early indications, this sounds like a wonderful opportunity for my company. I like what I've heard, from the buyer, et cetera, et cetera. So it's pretty straightforward. And there are situations, appropriately so, where this is not a good match. It's not a good dating scene, let alone a good marriage.
Right.
This date's not going well, and that's okay. That's good for both parties to understand that, but you need to kind of step up to that and say sometimes it's hard to give less than pleasant information. Everybody wants to hear yes. Well, sometimes there needs to be a no, and there are appropriate ways you can say that. So I would just encourage everybody to be forthright in that presentation. That makes for a good meeting.
Right. Talk to me about kind of the opposite, the flip side of the coin. I call them tells, and so you're experienced and you can probably pick up these tells a lot quicker than a lot of the sellers that you're representing. But give me a couple tells that you see from a management meeting and things you may pick up from the buyer where you say, okay, this isn't a match, right? Even maybe the other parties haven't caught on, but a couple tells that sometimes sellers miss that you think are important that might be an indication that this isn't a good match.
That's an interesting question. I'm giving away trade secrets, Marty, if I do this.
Well, speaking code, and then,
No, uh, uh, sometimes a tell will be if I'm on the sell side and a buyer is they're presenting themselves as more than what they really are. And you get it on both sides. You get the story from the seller, but sometimes I'll get a story from a buyer and about what I'll call it an aspirational view of the company. Okay, this is what they aspire to be, not what they are today.
right.
And so as I listen to that, if I get a sense that it's an aspirational view of who they really are and the backstory, that's a flag for me. So it's not a deal killer. It's just, okay, we need to investigate this. And sometimes it comes in the area of financing. One thing from a sell side, do I have a qualified buyer? There are buyers out there that aren't necessarily qualified, or they may be qualified at a different level. And they may be qualified to acquire or purchase or have financing for a smaller deal, but not for the deal that's on the table, potentially. So we're going to be listening. I'm going to be listening for the financial aspect of it. The other item, and it's not necessarily a tell, but the other thing that I look at closely is in our particular situation, oftentimes we're talking or we have first-time buyers in the marketplace. So not only sellers, but in the TechServe M&A Marketplace, we have a number of companies that are first-time buyers. They're trying to scale up. So they're fairly unsophisticated, or they are unsophisticated on the buy side. So they haven't made acquisitions before. And if they haven't thought through that process clearly, it's pretty easy to pick up on that. And as you know, everyone focuses on the front end. You focus on the offer and the LOI, and you focus on the, on the deal itself and the purchase and sale agreement. But, the due diligence and the integration and the real nitty gritty, that needs to be thought through. And so it's fairly easy to pick that up if a buyer is not prepared for that. And it's not, this is nothing against first time, because a first time buyer can be well prepared for, due diligence and for integration. So it's not necessarily being a first time buyer, but that's where I generally experience it and see it or hear it more often than not. So those are the, I'll say well, there's one more.
You're opening up, John. I like it. I like it. We are getting the trade secrets. We're getting the trade secrets. I like it.
Well, the other item that I say is if the buyer tells me or tells my seller that life is going to be wonderful and there are going to be no problems and we've got this thing down and it's going to be smooth sailing from here, 2 red flags went up. So because it's never smooth sailing, and that's okay. If we knew what the issues were going to be up front, we'd cover them. We'd address it early on. So you just need to be in a situation, and buyers are really aware of this for the most part. There's some give and take, and there are going to be some ups and downs, and part of my job is to counsel and work with the seller there to say, okay, this is to be expected. We didn't know this was going to occur, whatever this is, but here's how we work through it. So that's the other one that I find occasionally.
All of those make perfect sense, John. Let's shift gears and hit our last topic, because we're as I knew we would, we're grinding through our time here because there's so much information to get out. But we all know, we've all been involved. Deals crater. I mean, many don't. We close many deals, but there are deals that crater. A lot of different reasons. But in speaking to you, and I've now called this the silent deal killer. There's kind of an overlooked silent deal killer that I think sellers and buyers sometimes don't pay as much attention to. So, talk to me about that silent deal killer that you've spoken to me about, and when it can strike and how it can strike.
Right. I call it the FUD factor, FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And it comes into play at various times and at various levels. And it is fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And usually it's early in the process or maybe in the middle of the process. I'll tell you where it disappears. And that's when we're well into due diligence and we've gotten over some of the hurdles and we're getting near the end. It's usually gone by that time period. So I usually see it in the beginning and early stages or middle stages. And there's some tells to this fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And it usually begins with a phone call to me and said, I just talked to so-and-so. Okay, that's my flag just went up. And I've been thinking. Those are two dangerous. Or anyway, those are two big ones right there. And what we have to understand, and what the buyer needs to understand here is there is a large emotional component to a transaction. And I think more on the sell side than there is on the buy side, because the seller, as we stated earlier, their whole being is wrapped up in this company. So not only is there the physical aspect of it or the financial aspect, but there's this emotional side that's swirling around. Also, we need to understand that usually at this stage, the sellers by themselves. They have me at that point, and they may have a significant other or their spouse, maybe a business partner, but oftentimes they're by themselves. So they can't talk to their internal employees about it. So they're on an island. And as a result of that, that brings in, some uncertainty. Am I making the right decision? I don't have anybody to bounce it off of. I can't fly a trial balloon on this, to see how people feel about it. Those tactics are not available to me. So as a result, sometimes it creeps in. And as if we think about it logically, we take factual components and we compress those and we use those facts in order to make an informed decision, and we move forward. That feels right, and that's what we try and do. But there's always this second guess. We make this decision, and then we say, well, did I make the right decision? It's that buyer's remorse even before the transaction's done. So there's this buyer's remorse that sets in, and the buyer needs to recognize that is taking place, in this process. So, and it's oftentimes that's where the emotions sometimes become very apparent. I won't say get out of hand, but become apparent, and we've got to kind of step back and calm things down and move back into a traditional or regular process, I guess is the best way to put it. So very important part of the process. And, if the buyer understands that, I think it helps in the way that they frame questions and the approach to the seller. Most sellers that I see, Marty, because they're emotionally attached and they've built this business, there are usually a lot of questions around their team. What's going to happen to my team? My sales people, my recruiters, my back office staff. Miss Joe's been with me for 23 years doing all of my accounting work. Well, the reality is at some point in time, Miss Joe's probably going to go away. If it's a larger client, she can help in a transition, but those are those areas that we need to help that seller get through. And we may not know all the answers. That's the other part of it. There are times in this early process where the buyer needs to be prepared to say, I don't have an answer. They don't have to have an answer for everything. And transition or integration, sometimes there are components there that are unknown in the early stages. It's okay to say, I don't know. We know that's an important item to you. Here's what we're going to do to address it, and we'll work on it. And, at this particular point. So I think all of those enter into that fear, uncertainty, doubt. Anything we can do to reduce that will make the transaction go smoother and keep the seller in the game throughout the process.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important, understanding the emotions and putting, you're talking about the buyer a little bit, the buyer understanding and being aware of those emotions. Maybe you can check off a couple things that you've seen buyers do well. This will be probably our last question. A couple practices that you've seen buyers do well that's helped them manage the seller's emotions in a deal well.
The buyer needs to stay engaged at a senior level with the seller. And I say principal because sometimes it's a large buyer, and so that may not be possible, but there needs to be a focal point that can engage with that seller on a consistent basis and on two levels. Because what takes place is we're gathering information, we're gathering data on the buy side, and we're providing it on the seller side for the most part in the early stages. So that's the kind of that data stream going back and forth. But then I think there's and I won't say it's the emotional component, but it's the human stream of information that's going back and forth. And I think that the buy side can be asking questions and connecting with the buyer nearly as if they're two transactions taking place. There's this financial layer down here that's going back and forth. And then we're having this dialogue on, okay, what would you like to be doing? It's kind of, maybe it's part due diligence, part post-transition, but it's continual engaging the seller, as an individual, not only as owner of the company, but as an individual. And, okay, what does this look like? What maybe it's what part would you like to play, post-transaction, would you like to be X? And I've seen everything from, I want to exit immediately to, I'm okay with being a branch manager, post-transaction, or, kind of be a consultant for 6 months. But those pieces and those dialogues, keep the process moving, because there's dual items that are at play here. So I think if a buyer can do that and, remain, continue that attachment, it's good. As you and I both know, there comes a point early in this process where we have to have counsel. We have to have legal counsel, and we have outside financial counsel, usually on both sides. And so the tendency is, as we engage with counsel, that other relationship disappears. And or I won't say it's fractured, but it just stops. And I'd like to see that continue. I think it helps the transaction, and it can help from falling apart. Our legal counsel and financial counsel on both sides plays a very, very important role. They're there to reduce risk, to protect the buyer and the seller. Totally understood. But sometimes I think we kind of create a gap, we create a gap by leaving the other part out. So I would kind of encourage everybody to figure out a way that you can have that dialogue. And I know that I'm trying to do this quickly, Marty, but I know the tendency is, well, if we let the principals talk to each other, then they're going to be negotiating, and then they're going to say something they shouldn't be saying, or agreeing to something they shouldn't agree to. And yeah, that's a risk. But maybe there's a way to continue some of that dialogue without, muddying up the waters of the transaction, because there are some legal ramifications and financial ramifications that the principals need to stay away from, at this particular stage.
Yeah, I see it in two ways. I see that there's too much silence from buyers, right? They go through a period of time where
Yeah.
they're digging into the diligence, and it's necessary, right? A buyer has to do its due diligence.
Absolutely.
It's a very technical process, but they get their heads buried in that technical process, and there's a lot of silence that exists from the principal of the buyers to the principal of the sellers, and that often creates nervousness from a seller, mistrust, or wondering why there's so much time being spent on this diligence, right? It's quite a wearing process, right? I mean, sellers, never quite understand how much of a process diligence is. So I think that buyers have to be careful throughout that whole process and to continually engage the principals, like you said. Well, John, this has been exactly what I expected. We certainly could have gone on for more, but I really, really appreciate your time, and I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks down at SIA's Executive Forum.
Yes, that's going to be a wonderful trip. We're all looking forward to meeting in Austin. That'll be good for everybody.
I know Mark, you, and quite a few of the members of the TechServe Alliance will be there, so I look forward to catching up with you all down there.
Sounds great, Marty. I appreciate the opportunity. This has been very enjoyable.
Thank you, John. Have a good day. Take care.
Thanks. Goodbye.